There is a specific kind of person who ends up helping others through the darkest moments of their lives. Not the ones who studied it. Not the ones who read the right books or completed the right training. The ones who went through something. The ones who still carry it. You probably know someone like that. Or maybe, and this is the thing I want you to sit with for a moment, maybe you are someone like that. There's a wound you've been carrying for a long time. You've tried to explain it. You've tried to heal it. Some days you think you're past it, and then something small happens. A sentence, a smell, a particular kind of silence. And it's right there again. As if it never left. What if it was never supposed to leave? What if the wound isn't the problem, but the map? Jung spent decades studying the people who became the most profound healers, guides, and witnesses for others in pain. And what he found wasn't what anyone expected. It wasn't wholeness that made them capable. It wasn't resolution. It was the wound itself, carried consciously, transformed slowly, that gave them something no training ever could. That's what this is about. The word wounded makes people uncomfortable. We live in a culture that treats wounds as problems to be solved. Something breaks, you fix it. Something hurts, you medicate it. Something scars, you cover it. The entire architecture of modern wellness is built on this premise. That the goal is to arrive somewhere clean. Somewhere past the pain. Somewhere where the difficult thing no longer has any power over you. And there's nothing wrong with wanting that. The desire to stop hurting is one of the most human things there is. But there's a difference between healing and erasure. And most people, without ever realizing it, have been chasing erasure. Think about the wounds you carry, not the surface ones, the deeper ones, the kind that formed before you had language to describe them. The moment someone you trusted made you feel invisible. The loss that restructured everything around it. The version of yourself you had to abandon in order to survive a particular chapter of your life. Those wounds didn't just cause pain, they created something in you. A sensitivity, a capacity for perception that people who never went through that simply don't have. There's a word for this in neuroscience, post-traumatic growth. The research is real, and it's been replicated across cultures and contexts. People who move through genuine suffering, not around it, not past it, but through it, often develop capabilities that researchers describe as almost paradoxical. Greater empathy, deeper relational attunement, a tolerance for ambiguity and complexity that others find destabilizing. The ability to sit with someone in their darkest moment without needing to fix it, rush it, or look away. These aren't small things. These are rare things. But here's what the neuroscience doesn't fully explain. And where Jung goes further than the research. It's not just that suffering can produce growth as a side effect. It's that the wound itself, when it's met with consciousness, rather than avoidance, becomes a kind of instrument, a tuning fork, something that vibrates at a frequency that others in pain can feel and recognize before a single word is spoken. That recognition, that felt sense of being understood by someone who has been somewhere similar. It's not something you can manufacture. It's not something you can learn from a book. It arrives through lived experience, and it arrives precisely because the wound was never fully sealed. The question isn't whether you've been hurt. You have. The question is what you've done with it, and what it's quietly been doing with you. Jung didn't arrive at this idea from a distance. He arrived at it from inside it. By the time he was in his late 30s, he had already broken with Freud, the man who had been, in many ways, his intellectual father. The rupture wasn't clean. It wasn't professional. It was the kind of separation that leaves marks on the deeper layers of a person. The kind where you lose not just a relationship, but an entire framework for understanding yourself and your place in the world. Freud had seen Jung as his successor, the one who would carry the work forward into the next generation. And Jung had genuinely believed in that role, had shaped his identity around it for years. When it collapsed, it didn't just end a friendship, it ended a version of himself. What followed was a period he later described with unusual honesty, years of profound disorientation, vivid and disturbing inner imagery, a sense of the ground shifting beneath everything he thought he knew. He didn't hospitalize himself, he didn't stop working, but he also didn't pretend it wasn't happening. He went toward it. He documented it obsessively in what would later become known as the Red Book, hundreds of pages of dialogue with figures that emerged from his own unconscious, painted in rich medieval imagery, written in a language that sat somewhere between psychology and myth. Most of his colleagues thought he was losing his mind. Some said so openly. And from the outside, the concern wasn't entirely unreasonable. Here was one of the most rigorous psychological minds of his generation, filling notebooks with visions, speaking to inner figures he had named, descending nightly into territory that had no map and no precedent in the clinical literature he had helped build. What he was actually doing was something that had no name yet. He was descending into his own wound with full attention. Not to escape it, not to resolve it on the terms the surface world would recognize, but to understand what it was trying to show him, to follow it down until he found what was living at the bottom of it. And what he found changed everything, not just for him, but for everyone who came after. He began to see a pattern, not just in himself but across his patients, across mythology, across the shamanic traditions he had been studying in parallel. In culture after culture, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, the same structure kept appearing. The healer who had been broken, the guide who carried a limp, the one who descended into darkness and came back changed, not healed in the conventional sense, but transformed in a way that made them capable of accompanying others into the same darkness without flinching. In Greek mythology, it's Chiron, the centaur who taught Achilles, Hercules, Asclepius, and dozens of others the arts of war, medicine, and wisdom. Chiron was immortal, and Chiron was wounded by a poisoned arrow that could never fully heal. He couldn't die from it. He couldn't recover from it. He simply carried it. And from that unresolvable wound, from that permanent ache that never left him, he taught others how to live, how to fight, how to heal, how to face what they were afraid of. The image is precise. It isn't metaphor decorating a point. It is the point. Think about what it means to be permanently wounded and still be the one others come to. It means you never get to pretend. You never get to stand at a comfortable distance from suffering and offer advice from safety. You are always, in some sense, still in it. And that proximity, that inability to fully leave, is exactly what makes you trustworthy to someone who is in it right now. They can feel it, not in what you say, in how you hold the space, In the fact that you don't flinch, don't rush them, don't need them to be better faster so that you can feel more comfortable. The wound that doesn't heal completely, the one that stays tender, that still aches under certain pressures, is exactly the wound that keeps you honest. It keeps you close to the ground of real human suffering. It prevents the particular kind of arrogance that comes from believing you've arrived somewhere others haven't. It makes you useful in the specific way that only someone who has been genuinely lost can be useful to someone who is lost right now. Not because you have the answers, but because you know what it feels like to not have them, and to keep moving anyway. There is a particular kind of person who finds their way to this idea, and it's almost never by accident. They tend to be the ones people call in a crisis. Not the most qualified person in the room necessarily, not the one with the most credentials or the most composed exterior, but the one who somehow knows how to be present when things fall apart, the one who doesn't try to fix it immediately, the one whose presence, for reasons that are hard to articulate, makes the unbearable slightly more bearable. People gravitate toward them without fully understanding why, and often the person being gravitated toward doesn't fully understand it either. If that description lands somewhere in you, it's worth pausing on. Because there's a question underneath it that most people never ask directly. Not, why am I good at this? But why did I have to become good at this? What was the original training ground? What happened early enough and deep enough that you developed this particular set of capacities as a response? Because these things don't appear from nowhere. They are built. Slowly, quietly, usually in circumstances that gave you no choice but to build them. For a lot of people, the answer involves having been the one who held things together when things should have been held together for them. The child who learned to read the emotional temperature of a room before they learned to read words on a page. The teenager who became the confidant for a parent who had no one else to turn to. The person who became the listener, the stabilizer, the one who absorbed what others couldn't carry. Not because they chose it consciously, but because the situation required it, and they were capable of it, and no one else was stepping forward. That kind of formation leaves marks. It creates real skill, and it also creates a specific kind of exhaustion that doesn't respond to rest, because it isn't physical. It's the exhaustion of having spent years giving from a place that was never fully replenished, of being the strong one before you were finished being the young one, of learning, very early, that your needs were secondary, that the way to be loved, or at least safe, was to be useful. Jung had a concept for the psychological structure that forms around this. He called it the persona, the face we build for the world, the role we learn to perform so consistently that we begin to mistake it for who we actually are. And for people shaped by early wounding into caretaking, the persona of the strong one, the capable one, the one who doesn't need much and never falls apart, can become so solid and so well practiced that it starts to feel like identity rather than adaptation, like character rather than armor. The problem isn't the strength. The strength is real. The problem is what gets buried underneath it in order to maintain it. Because every persona, every role that becomes too rigid, too defended, casts a shadow. And the shadow of the perpetually capable person tends to contain everything they never allowed themselves to need. The grief they didn't have space to feel. The anger that had nowhere safe to go. the longing to be held, rather than to always be the one holding. The younger, more vulnerable self that got quietly set aside in favor of the one who could function, who could help, who could be relied upon. That self didn't disappear. It went underground. This is where the wound and the gift become almost impossible to separate, because the same experience that created the wound is precisely what created the capacity. You cannot have one without the other. You cannot surgically remove the pain and keep the depth it produced. You cannot erase what happened and retain what it gave you. They are the same thing, seen from different angles. And this is exactly where most people get stuck. They want the gift without the wound. They want the empathy, the perception, the ability to hold space for others in pain. But they want it to come from somewhere clean, somewhere resolved, somewhere that doesn't still ache when the pressure finds the right spot. They want to be healed before they help, finished before they offer anything. But the ache is part of the instrument. It always has been. There is a moment that happens for almost everyone who carries this kind of wound consciously enough. It usually doesn't arrive with fanfare. It arrives quietly, sideways, in the middle of an ordinary moment. You're sitting with someone who is struggling, a friend, a colleague, sometimes a stranger. And something in you recognizes what they're carrying before they've finished describing it. Not because you've read about it, because you've lived in a version of that same room. You know the specific texture of that particular darkness, the way it distorts time, the way it makes everything that used to feel solid feel suddenly provisional, the way it convinces you in its worst hours that it has always been this way and always will be. And instead of looking away, you stay. That staying, that capacity to remain present in the face of pain without being destroyed by it and without needing to immediately resolve it, is not a personality trait. It's not something you were simply born with. It was forged. In the specific circumstances that hurt you, in the years of learning, consciously or not, how to hold difficult things without dropping them, how to keep functioning when the ground beneath you was unreliable, how to find, somewhere inside the chaos, a stillness that didn't depend on the outside world cooperating. That's not a small thing. Most people never develop it. Not because they lack the capacity, but because they were never asked to. Jung called this the difference between neurotic suffering and authentic suffering. Neurotic suffering is pain that circles, that repeats, that stays attached to the story of what happened rather than moving through toward something. It's the wound kept open not by the original injury, but by the refusal, usually unconscious, to fully feel it and let it change you. Authentic suffering is different. It's pain that moves. That transforms the one who carries it. That leaves something behind, not just scar tissue, but a different kind of sight. The distinction matters enormously, because both look the same from the outside, at least for a while. Both involve a person who has been genuinely hurt. The difference is in what the person is doing with the carrying, whether they are dragging it behind them as evidence of what was done to them, or whether they have, slowly and with great difficulty, begun to integrate it into the coherent story of who they are becoming. Integration is a word Jung used carefully. It doesn't mean resolution in the sense of the pain going away. It doesn't mean forgiveness in the sense of pretending it was acceptable. It means something more demanding than either of those things. It means looking at what happened fully, without the protective distortions of either victimhood or premature closure, and allowing it to become part of the story of who you are, not the whole story, not the defining story, but a real chapter with real weight that makes the whole arc legible. That makes you legible, to yourself first and eventually to others. When that integration begins to happen, and it is always a beginning, always incomplete, always ongoing, something shifts in how the wound functions. It stops being purely a source of pain and starts being something else. A reference point, a form of knowledge that lives in the body rather than just in the mind. An ability to recognize certain things instantly that others have to work hard to perceive at all. The quality of someone's silence, the specific way a person holds their shoulders when they're carrying something they haven't said out loud. This is what the shamanic traditions understood so clearly that they built it directly into their initiation structures. In many indigenous cultures, the shaman was specifically chosen from among those who had survived a serious illness, a profound loss, or a psychological crisis that brought them close to dissolution. Not despite that history, because of it. The community understood that the capacity to accompany others into the dark places required someone who had already been there, who had found in the middle of their own disintegration that there was something that didn't disintegrate, something that held even when everything else gave way. That something, that part of you that survived what you survived, is not separate from your wound. It was revealed by it. The wound was the excavation. What it uncovered was already there, waiting. There is a cost to carrying this kind of depth that almost nobody talks about openly. And it's worth talking about. Because if you've made it this far in this conversation, you're probably not someone who needs to be convinced that the wound has value. You already sense that. What you may be less clear on, what most people in this territory are less clear on, is what it actually demands of you to carry it well, without being consumed by it, without losing yourself inside it, without letting the gift quietly hollow you out from the inside while you're busy making sure everyone around you is okay. Because that happens too. More often than most people in this space are willing to admit. The wounded healer who never tends to their own wound doesn't become wise, they become depleted. And then, often without realizing it, they begin using other people's pain to avoid their own. The helping becomes compulsive. The being needed becomes a substitute for being known. The focus on others becomes a way of never having to sit in the particular silence where your own unprocessed material lives. That specific uncomfortable quiet where the things you haven't finished feeling are still waiting, patient and persistent, for you to finally turn toward them. Jung was direct about this. He believed that a therapist, or anyone who works seriously with the inner life of others, could only take someone as far as they themselves had gone. Not in terms of having experienced the same things, but in terms of having been willing to descend into their own darkness with genuine honesty, to face what was there without looking away, to resist the temptation of premature resolution, of declaring yourself healed before the real work was finished, because the real work was uncomfortable and the declaration was easier, and everyone around you seemed to find it reassuring. This is the shadow side of the wounded healer archetype, and it shows up in patterns that are worth naming precisely because they are easy to mistake for virtues. It shows up as the person who is endlessly available for everyone else's crisis but mysteriously unavailable for their own. Who can sit with a friend's grief for hours but becomes restless and deflective when someone tries to sit with theirs. Who has built an identity so thoroughly around being the one who helps that the idea of needing help feels like a threat to something fundamental, not just to their self-image, but to their sense of why they are here, of what justifies their presence, of what makes them worth something. It shows up as burnout that gets misread as dedication, as the helper who keeps giving past the point of having anything left to give, not because they are noble, but because stopping would require them to feel something they've been successfully avoiding by staying in motion. Rest becomes threatening. Stillness becomes dangerous, because in the stillness, what has been circling finally lands. It shows up sometimes as a subtle but persistent dynamic where the wound is kept slightly open, unconsciously maintained at just the right level of unresolved. Because a fully integrated wound would mean losing the identity that formed around it. The suffering became the story became the self, and somewhere beneath the awareness, the self is quietly afraid of what remains when the story is finished. Who am I if I am not the one who survived this? What do I offer, if not this particular kind of hard-won depth? None of this is moral failure. It's human. It's what happens when something real and deep in a person goes unexamined long enough that the defense mechanisms around it start to look like virtues, start to look like sensitivity or dedication or depth. And they are those things partly, but they are also partly avoidance wearing the clothes of purpose. The path through it isn't to stop helping. It isn't to close off or toughen up, or decide that your own needs finally matter more than everyone else's. It's something quieter and more specific than any of that. It's learning, usually slowly, usually with considerable resistance, to apply the same quality of attention to yourself that you so naturally offer to others, to become, in the Jungian sense, your own witness, to hold your own experience with the same patience, the same refusal to rush toward resolution, the same willingness to stay present with what is uncomfortable, that makes you so genuinely valuable to the people around you. The healer who can do that, who has learned to be wounded and conscious of the wounds simultaneously, is something rare. Not because the capacity is rare, but because the willingness to do that work on yourself, without an audience, without recognition, without the quiet validation that comes from being the one who helps, is one of the most difficult things a person can choose to sustain. There's something I want to say before we move toward the end of this, if you've stayed with this video until now. And I mean really stayed, not just had it running in the background while you did something else. That itself tells me something about you. People who aren't carrying this particular kind of weight don't usually make it this far into a conversation like this one. They lose interest somewhere around the middle, where it stops being abstract and starts becoming personal, where it stops being about Jung and Chiron and shamanic traditions, and starts being about the specific unfinished thing inside them that they haven't fully turned toward yet. You're still here. That means something. And because you're still here, I want to ask you something directly. if what we've been exploring together resonates with you. If this channel is giving you something that feels worth returning to, consider subscribing. Not as a favor to me, but because the work we're doing here, video by video, is cumulative. Each one builds on the last. The shadow, the active imagination, the wounded healer, these aren't isolated topics. They're different entry points into the same territory. And if you're in the middle of a real process of inner work, having that continuity matters more than people realize. The algorithm won't always show you what comes next. Subscribing means you won't miss it when it arrives. Now, back to where we were. Because there's one more thing that needs to be said about the wounded healer, and it's the thing most people overlook entirely. The wound has a direction. It isn't just a source of depth. It isn't just a credential for empathy or a justification for the sensitivity you've always carried. It points somewhere specific, and part of what integration means, part of what the conscious carrying of the wound eventually produces over time and with real attention, is a growing clarity about where your particular wound is pointing you, what it has been all along preparing you for. Not in a grandiose sense, not in the sense of a destiny that sets you apart from ordinary life or places you above the people you serve, but in the quieter, more specific sense of, this is the territory I know. This is the place I can enter that others cannot. This is the door I can hold open because I found my way through it once, in the dark, and I remember where the handles are. Chiron didn't teach everyone. He taught specific people. Achilles, who needed to learn that strength without wisdom eventually turns against itself. Asclepius, who would become the god of medicine, the one who learned the art of healing from the one who could not heal himself. Jason, Patroclus, each of them shaped by contact with a teacher who carried something unresolvable and offered it, not as a limitation, but as a form of knowledge that no intact person could have given them. The wounding and the teaching were not separate events in Chiron's life. They were the same event, unfolding across time. The arrow that couldn't be removed was also the source. The permanent ache was also the credential. Your wound is like that. It has students in it that you haven't met yet. People who will find their way to you. Not because you advertised yourself. Not because you built the right platform or said the right things at the right moment. But because wounds recognize each other across a room. Because something in the way you hold your own suffering signals, without words, that you are safe, that you have been somewhere similar, that you will not flinch when it gets difficult, will not rush toward resolution because their pain is making you uncomfortable, will not require them to be further along than they actually are. That signal is not something you manufacture. It's not something you practice or perform. It's something you become. Through the long, unglamorous, largely invisible work of turning toward your own interior with honesty. Of sitting with what is difficult in yourself the same way you sit with what is difficult in others. Of choosing, again and again, the harder path of consciousness over the easier path of staying in motion and calling it purpose. That is the hidden purpose behind every scar you carry, not the scar itself. What the scar has been quietly, patiently, relentlessly making you into. There is an old alchemical image that keeps returning to me as I think about how to close this. It's the image of the lapis, the philosopher's stone, not gold, not the final product the popular imagination associates with alchemy, the stone itself. The thing that, according to the alchemical texts, was found in the most unlikely place, not in rare materials, not in precious metals or exotic substances imported from distant lands. The texts are precise about this, almost stubbornly so. The lapis was found in what had been thrown away, in the rejected material, in what the alchemist had initially looked past because it seemed too common, too broken, too far from what they were searching for. They called it the prima materia, the first matter, the raw, unrefined, often repulsive starting material from which everything else was made. And the central insight of alchemy, the one that Jung spent years unpacking as a map of psychological transformation, was that the gold was already in the lead, not as a different substance waiting to be substituted, as the lead itself, seen differently, worked with differently, held with a different quality of attention over a long enough period of time. Your wound is the prima materia, not a metaphor for it, not something that resembles it from a distance. The actual raw material from which your particular form of depth, perception, and capacity for genuine contact with others has been and continues to be made. The thing you would have chosen to discard if you could have. The thing that has felt, at various points, like the central obstacle to the life you were supposed to be living. It was never an obstacle. It was always the material. And here is what I want to leave you with, not as a conclusion, because this kind of work doesn't conclude, but as something to carry forward into whatever comes next for you. The people who have helped you most in your life, the ones whose presence actually changed something in you, whose words landed somewhere real rather than just passing through, I would guess that most of them were carrying something. Not visibly, not performatively, but you could feel it. Something in them had been tested and had not broken. Something in them knew the territory they were sitting in with you, because they had lived in a version of it themselves. That is what you are becoming for someone else, maybe for many people. Not through the erasure of what hurt you, through its transformation, through the slow, difficult, largely unwitnessed work of turning toward yourself with the same quality of presence you have always been willing to offer others. Chiron never stopped being wounded. He carried the arrow his entire life. And he became the greatest teacher in Greek mythology not in spite of that, but because of the particular kind of humility and knowledge and undefended presence that only an unhealed wound, consciously carried, can produce. You don't have to be finished to be useful. You don't have to be whole to be a guide. You just have to be honest about where you are and willing to keep going. If this video gave you something worth keeping, share it with someone who needs it. Not someone you think would find it interesting, but someone you know is carrying something right now. And leave a comment below. Not a reaction, but something real. What does your wound point toward? What has it been making you into that you're only beginning to see? We'll be here next time, going further in.